Welcome to Navigating Receiverships, a podcast from the Commercial Receivers Association, focused on building a better understanding of what brings companies into receivership, what happens in receivership, what makes them unique, some alternatives to receiverships, and ultimately, what happens to the business as the receivership is closed out. I'm one of your hosts, Eric Morcheski, CRA board member and CEO of Nimble Strategies. Welcome to Navigating Receiverships. I'm here today with Deborah Cannon, President and CEO of CUSA, LLC. We're going to talk about some of the experience that she and her firm have had over the years in receiverships. Deborah, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so tell us a little bit about your background. How did you get into
I started my career with Hyatt Hotels many years ago, and then a number of 4- and 5-star hotel properties, members of leading hotels of the world, and then got into the hotel management company side versus individual hotels, and started with Brookshire Hotels. Was with them for 8 years and just worked my way up through that organization. And when I left, I was the vice president of development for them. And then prior to that, I was the corporate director of sales and marketing, and I oversaw all the sales and marketing efforts of our hotels. And the partner of that firm, Charles Taylor, the Brookshire completed a private placement, a Wall Street private placement, and he worked out his time with them and was going to start his own organization. And he asked me if I would join him in that endeavor, and I said to him that I would join him, but as a partner. So we became partners, and we formed Cornerstone, which later became CUSA, and that was back in 1991. Ever since then, we've been managing hotels, all different types and styles of hotels, everything from limited to full service, 11-room bed and breakfasts, all the way up to 1,000-room convention hotels. So we run the gamut of different hotels that we manage. We are a nationwide company, so we manage hotels all across the United States. And currently, we have about 35 hotels that we have under management.
Obviously, hospitality has been an industry that's been hit pretty hard over these last 4 or 5 years in COVID and thereafter. So a lot of hospitality and a lot of hotels going through a receivership process for a variety of reasons, but we're going to dive into that then. So can you tell us a little bit about the receivership you are sharing with us today, and maybe what was going on with the company and what some of the problems were that kind of led it into receivership?
Sure. We've been dealing with receiverships and the world of troubled assets for a long time. Going back to the late 80s with Brookshire, we did a lot of receivership work then. And then in the early 1990s, you had another downturn, and we worked with Amoresco and all of the major RTC and FDIC days. So we've been through actually, I think, 4 economic downturns where you had receiverships and foreclosures come into play in a big way. It's interesting to me that what they thought would happen with COVID in the hospitality industry did not necessarily materialize in lots of receiverships like it did in the early 1990s. What happened was you had the government really putting money into, in a very aggressive way, if you will, into businesses. So you didn't have as many hotels come back that they had anticipated. However, there were, a number of organizations that did see receivership for one reason or another. A lot of them were those that were really highly leveraged or full service and, really overnight lost everything in COVID when you had to shut down and couldn't do any group bookings at all. Those were very tough situations. And we work a lot with groups like Rialto and others who are very large players in that world.
Yeah, I mean, I think you talked about high leverage, and I think that's one of the things that really came out of COVID is a lot of these assets were taking on additional loans during COVID so that they could stay afloat, but being able to service those loans post-COVID has been trouble. And I think at least in St. Louis here, we're seeing more and more hit the market into receivership actions or distressed actions because of what happened a few years ago, you touched on something that's very true, in that a lot of those properties really did take on the cash from the government in different ways, whether that was PPP loans or anything else, but and that helped them survive through that period of time. But if they haven't bounced back significantly shortly thereafter, that leverage that they took on really has played out in a negative fashion for them. So,
Yeah, and I think it depends on the diversity of the market that the individual hotel was in. For example, if your hotel was heavily dependent on group business, then it took a lot longer to recover than a hotel that had more transient as their mix of business. Also, corporate took a long time to come back. And group took the longest, corporate being second, and then transient came back the quickest. So it all depended on where the hotel was located as to how much of an effect COVID had on its future business. So you did see different pockets of the country, more receiverships in those areas than others. And you did see those that were dependent on a certain type of business, whether it be corporate or group. You saw those go into receivership more often.
yeah. So diving kind of into the receivership itself, what was the property? Where was it located? What about this one stood out to you a little
Well,
bit?
it's interesting to me. We've done about, gosh, over 100 receiverships over the years. And during these last couple of years, I want to talk about one in particular that is in upstate New York. And it's interesting to me because this particular one, when you deal with hotels and receiverships, there's some landmines, if you will, that seem to be they give a sense of urgency in getting into receivership for banks and institutions. And what I mean by that is that, the franchise is in jeopardy when the hotel goes into any type of default. And if the hotel loses its franchise, often that will cut its business overnight by 50%. So it can be very tricky in, letting those particular assets go out any length of time and not being urgent in trying to get a receivership appointed, mainly because, if you do lose the franchise, then there's not a lot we can do to get it back. So in one particular case, we were in a situation where we were brought in, and there was a sense of urgency. It was a franchise that was about to be lost. And when we went in the door, we started to work with the franchise and all of the different things that were involved with the hotel. Often we'll go into the hotel and it's been poorly run for quite some time, as I'm sure many assets that go into receivership are, that the borrower is just not focused on keeping up the assets. So we're trying to do all those things. And within 2 days, I think it was, we received an inspection from the franchise. And of course, the hotel failed the inspection. We had only been in there 2 days and the borrower had allowed it to really deteriorate. Well, when we failed the inspection, the franchise came back and said, we're going to pull the franchise unless you appear before the board of directors and give us a reason as to why you should be allowed to stay in. So we had to quickly assemble, a team, get things going, get a presentation made, to a very formal presentation to the board of directors of this particular franchise. And I'm proud to say that we were able to get them to give us a time to do what we needed to do. But that was very critical in saving this particular asset, because then we were able to do the things we needed to do to make the asset better, but then also be able to improve the business that was coming into the property. And by the time we got to the years period of time that they had given us to really do what we needed to do with the franchise, we were well on our way to being able to put it up for sale and do what we needed to do there. So I share that to say that there are nuances to hotels when you go in and you have franchises and you have other things that have to be satisfied. Those just don't go away when you go into receivership. In fact, in this case, they intensified And we really were in a position to quickly come together, put the things necessary that needed to be done, and then get in front of the decision makers and really get them to give us more time in doing what we needed to do and save that franchise.
Yeah, the franchise and then the liquor license are the two that always readily come to mind when I think of hotels and hospitality. Of, you know, does the local liquor board see it as a transfer of ownership, or when a receiver
Right.
comes in, and it seems to be location to location based in how they handle it and what they want to do with those type of things. But if you lose, obviously, the flag, you talked about losing 50 to 60% of your business, or you you lose the liquor license and there, or you're losing sales and revenues. I mean, if the role of the receiver is
Absolutely.
to do no harm, it's hard to not do any harm. If you step in and day one you start losing those valuable pieces to it, even though it had nothing to do with what you've done as the receiver. uh,
Right.
I
And
always
you've got to quickly, and you're absolutely right. You've got to quickly try to see what you've been dealt very quickly. Assess everything that's you've got in front of you, whether it's life safety, health department, liquor licenses, franchise, all those things, and then determine what can you do to mitigate through those things. It's no longer that a receiver would go in and just hold what he's got. That's very rare in our industry.
Mhm.
You've really got to quickly circumvent, satisfy, change the direction of where the hotel is going, or and then quickly try to mitigate all of the different things that are necessary in order to move the asset forward. You're not just babysitting or sitting on it. You really got to do a lot of different things to make sure that you can move everything to where it needs to go.
And provide a value, right, to return either through sale or whatever the action is that you're trying to move through. Obviously, you start losing those pieces, and you're talking about losing tremendous value in the resale of the property if it's going through some form of a sale process.
Boy, that is such a great point. Because if you lose a significant amount of business, i.e., if you can't get that liquor license in place and you have to shut down your food and beverage operation, obviously there's a great loss of revenue in that. If you lose the franchise, often the value of the hotel plummets overnight.
Mhm.
So all of those things go to the future value of the hotel, and you're trying your best to make sure that you're doing everything you can to not harm the future value and to actually increase the future value. And that's one of the things that CUSA is very good at, and why we've done so many receiverships for hotels over the years, is because we've been able to go into really very difficult situations and be able to turn those things around, whether it be through putting in a good sales and marketing program, or whether it be through mitigating the franchise dynamic, or whether it be just working with the institution to say, okay, here's what we need to do to make this better. Here's something that we need to invest on the front end that you'll get your money out when we sell it. Because often, as you know, institutions don't want to put any money
Mhm.
because they've already lost money in the prospect. So, now you're looking at, okay, how do we get them to do life safety, things that are going to keep the franchise happy, things that are going to improve the value of the actual asset to clients. And how do we get them to maneuver to do those things so that in the long run, the hotel will sell at a better price? And we've been good at that. And also getting into new business and being able to create opportunities where the hotel has just really outperformed where it was when we came in.
So the other challenge I see in hospitality and hotels, especially, you're working on a national basis. Staffing is obviously critical, right? In that, even though people don't think of it this way, hospitality is a labor intensive industry. And so, you've walked into a lot of these scenarios. What do you do to make sure that you're not having the staff walk out the door? Or do you just bring in your own staff? I mean, that's easier to do if you only stay local, right? When you start talking national, it's really hard to just say we've got 50 people ready to roll tomorrow into a new property.
Yeah, yeah, there's no way that a hotel company can go in and staff up 50 people, in a hotel. You've got to retain the staff that's there. Now, I've had owners who were, or borrowers, I should say, who were angry with the process. And I had one in particular who terminated all of the staff right before we walked in because they thought that would hurt the bank. And what we did was we quickly got the names and, phone numbers of those that he did terminate and called them back and got some of them to come back, some didn't. But we start with whatever skeleton crew we have and we work through it. We have the ability to bring in task force managers and key man positions throughout the country. And that helps us a lot. But those line level positions, you cannot bring in an entire crew to do that. So you got to retain the staff that's there. And obviously human resources and personnel is a huge issue in our industry, whether you're in receivership or not. So really letting the first thing we do is have an all employee meeting where we go through what's happening and that they are secure and that they, don't need to panic, that we're going to take good care of them, that their jobs are secure. We go through that type of process with them because you don't want to lose the entire staff when you walk into a property. So we're very sensitive to that.
That's great. So, this receivership in upstate New York, were there, when you walked away from it in the end, hopefully to a outcome that you felt was successful, even if sometimes someone once said to me, a true successful receivership means everyone walks away upset. But, were there any key takeaways or lessons learned that you felt like this was really good for us to understand better so that we can be better managers? Obviously, you've done this a number of times, as you talked about, through the 80s and the 90s and everything. So this one coming in well into your career, you have a different perspective on it maybe than if this was your second one you had ever done.
I think that the things that I've learned over the years, just in general, not with specifically the one in upstate New York, but in general, that one of the keys to any good receivership is the receiver order. And I often will talk with attorneys and the institutions that I work with, and there are key things we want to make sure are in those receiver orders. A clear understanding that all bank accounts and all, any money on hand, anything like that, that there's a clear break and that it clearly is the receivers. That any licenses, and liquor license comes into play here, any other licenses that they have, that they all transfer to the receiver. And then we sort out. Now, with the liquor license as an example to that, if in the order it says that all licenses transfer, at least that gives our attorneys a starting point, if you will, with the individual organizations that we need to work with the state. It helps us to do that. Also, with all of the bank accounts, if it's clearly written, I can walk into a bank and say, here's the order, and it clearly states what, that we have full control over the bank accounts. With the franchise, that it's important that that is enumerated in the receiver order, because the first thing the franchise asks for is the receiver order. And that can make a difference as to whether or not as the receiver, they can hold me accountable for past due franchise fees. And I want to stay away from that. I want a receiver order that tells the world that past due bills of the borrower are the borrowers, not the receivers. That will keep you current going forward, but as much as we can, we want it in the receiver order that we're not responsible for back bills. That just gives us, as a receiver, it gives us a whole lot more teeth in working with the individual people that we have to work with to keep things moving and going.
And So, is there anything that you feel others should take away from this? Like if someone's listening right now and they're going, this is, fascinating, either as an attorney, as another receiver, is there anything that you feel like beyond what you just shared, which was great, but is there anything else you feel like people should really take away from your experience from this receivership?
The one thing that I say to a lot of my institution clients when they come to me and they're talking to me about, here, I have this hotel, I'm getting no information on it. I'm afraid that he's, not only is he defaulted on his mortgage, but he probably is in the rears with
Like, yeah.
franchise,
Yeah.
utilities, taxes, all those things. And one of the things I say to them is, it is extremely important that you get control of the asset as soon as possible. And they then will say to me, well, we can go through the foreclosure process, but then, you can also, you run the risk of him filing bankruptcy, et cetera. And with receiverships, you do that too. However, if you can give away something on the front end that's not as significant to you, you may not, it might be a personal guarantee that's not worth the paper that it's written on. I don't know what that might be, but if you
Mhm.
can do something on the front end that then makes the borrower agree to the receiver order, not
Mhm.
fight it,
Yep.
then you are way ahead of the game in getting control of the asset and then understanding exactly what you need to do to fix it. If you play the game with the borrower and he resists and he keeps, pushing it off, and then you go down the foreclosure route, likely the asset is deteriorating. And by the time you do get it, it is far worse than what it would have been had you been able to get the receivership in place. So I often tell them, is there something that you can give up on the front end to get that borrower to agree to the receiver order before you go into the court? And that is significant.
That's a really good point. It's one that every defendant's counsel wants to figure out how they're getting around, is that personal guarantee, right? They already know they've lost the asset if you're going through a liquidation process and not a restructuring. And they want to know, how do we minimize the damage? And I do think you've made a really good point there of, this is their whole livelihood more than likely. And so there probably isn't a ton more assets sitting on the sidelines for them to pursue. So why not really just try to use it to motivate agreement and
Right,
a more
right.
partnership approach to the receivership?
And obviously, every case is individual and every
Mhm.
case has to be looked at for its individual merits. I'm
Mhm.
not saying that's a blanket thing, but but I will say that if you're able to get the borrower to agree, the amount of money that you will save in legal fees, in getting control of the asset, when you do get control, the deterioration of the asset, and then just the value of the asset is plummeting every day. You got to weigh that and say, what could I give up on the front end that is not as valuable as that?
Yeah.
And then make that decision. Um,
Yeah. It's a great point. Yeah. So I have one last question for you. This is going to be the hardest one of the day.
mhm.
Very unique, exclusively to you. Favorite property that you've been to?
Oh, my
You're
favorite
in,
property.
you're in
Um,
hospitality. I have a suggestion if you run out of ideas, but
I'm always looking for beautiful places to go, but I tell you, because I was just in the Greek islands, and there's the Hotel Atlantis,
Mhm.
which sits on the Greek island of Santorini, and it's at the very top, and it's the only thing out there. It is one of the most unique experiences. So that was just a cool place to be.
Yeah, that sounds pretty incredible. I was thinking closer to home for you. I was thinking maybe Sea Island would be
Yeah, that's nice.
a
Yes.
beautiful property not too far from you. So
Well,
yeah.
there are some stunning hotels around the world,
Mhm.
and certainly in the United States, just unique places to go. I over the years, I've been to so many different especially being affiliated with leading hotels of the world. I got to stay in some very unique hotels over the years. So I don't know that I could pick one that was an absolute favorite.
Yeah, it's my favorite question to ask hospitality people. Um, I don't usually get a singular answer, but I usually get oh, I'd really like to go to that one too.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time today with this. I think this is a great lesson to be learned. There were some great tips that you shared in here with us.
Great.
So again, thank you for joining us. And
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity. And if we can ever help somebody, we will always want to do that. Just even if it's just advice, if someone has a project that they're looking at and that they think might go in this direction, I often will, just talk with people and let them know what my thoughts are. So I'm happy to do that.
well, thank you so much, Deborah. It was great chatting with you.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining Navigating Receiverships, brought to you by the Commercial Receivers Association. Find more information at commercialreceiver.org and catch every Navigating Receiverships podcast by subscribing through your favorite platform today.